Dead ends. A small town buried this case for 40 years. He carried a briefcase for 42 years. Inside it, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings, the names of men he believed had gotten away with murder. A private archive, built across an entire career, maintained long after retirement, kept current until the day he couldn't keep it anymore. He died in October 2024 of a heart attack at 68 years old. 6 months later, 6 months. The men whose names were in that briefcase were arrested. He never saw it. That detail is the whole story, not just of this case, of what happens when a system decides that certain victims can wait, that certain files can sit, that certain communities can be left to hold their silence indefinitely because nobody with institutional authority cared enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Herbert, we'll use only his first name, was a police officer in Covington, Louisiana. A small city on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, 30 miles from New Orleans, 11,000 people, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and that fact cuts both ways. He was one of the first officers on the scene on February 12, 1982. He knew the victim. She was 16 years old. Her name for this episode is Rachel. And what Herbert saw that morning in a wooded stretch near the St. Tammany Parish Fairgrounds, what had been done to a 16-year-old girl who was somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, somebody's kin, changed him in a way that never resolved. So he started documenting. He documented for 4 decades, while the case went cold. While the men the community whispered about continued living in Covington, walking the same streets, existing in the same social fabric as the people who knew what they had done and said nothing. While the physical evidence collected at the scene sat in institutional storage, unprocessed with modern technology, for 30 years after the tools to crack it became available. Herbert kept writing. He kept clipping. He kept the briefcase close. His son watched him do this across an entire lifetime. Watched his father carry something the system had put down. Watched a man make a private argument year after year to no one in particular. The argument that a 16-year-old girl who had been raped and strangled and left in the woods for trail riders to find deserved better than a legacy file, and a silence that the whole town maintained like a second secret. In the final months of his life, Herbert sat down with the Louisiana State Police detective who had finally, in 2023, decided to look at the case again. He opened the briefcase. He shared everything. Then he died. 6 months before the arrests. This is the story of Rachel, of what happened to her in February 1982, of a community that knew and a system that waited, and one man who refused to stop asking a question that nobody around him wanted to answer. It is also the story of what it costs a family when the answer takes 43 years to arrive. And it is the story of how, in 2025, a podcast did what 4 decades of official investigation had not. You are going to want to stay for all of it. Rachel was 16 years old in February 1982. She was already a mother. Her daughter was an infant, young enough that the world was still just shapes and sounds and the specific warmth of the person who held her most. Young enough that she would grow up with no memory of her mother's face, no memory of her voice, only the shape of an absence that would define things she couldn't yet name. People who knew Rachel described a girl who was trying. That word, trying, carries weight when you are 16 and a mother and navigating the gap between the life you imagined and the one that is actually in front of you. She was present. She was known in her neighborhood. She moved through the streets of Covington the way young people do in small cities, with the particular visibility of someone who belongs to a place, who is recognized, who is part of the fabric of a community in the specific way that people are when everyone around them has watched them grow up. She was known to the men who would eventually be charged with her murder. That is not incidental. It is the center of everything. Covington, Louisiana sits on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, 30 miles from New Orleans, close enough to feel the city's gravitational pull, far enough to exist in its own register. 11,000 people in 1982. A downtown with the bones of a functioning small city. Courthouse, hardware store, churches on most corners, the fairgrounds where the annual Dixie Trail Ride drew families from across the parish every February. It was not, by any external measure, a dangerous place. But every small town has a geography that outsiders can't read from a map. A social architecture of obligation and kinship and unspoken agreement about what gets said publicly and what stays behind closed doors, and who gets protected when the two come into conflict. In Covington in 1982, that architecture would prove more powerful than any police investigation. The men who would eventually face charges were embedded in the same community Rachel moved through. Local. Known. Teenagers and young adults in February 1982, the same age or only a few years older than the girl they would be charged with killing. For this episode, we will describe them only in those terms. 4 men, all local, all known, all of whom would, in various configurations of freedom and incarceration, live the next 43 years in the long shadow of what happened one night in February. One of them would never leave Covington. He would walk those streets for 4 decades, go to the same stores, exist in the same city where people whispered his name and never said it loud enough for it to matter, until April 21, 2025, when a SWAT team arrived at his door. And then there was Herbert. He was a young Covington police officer in February 1982, the kind of cop who took the work seriously, not as a job, but as something closer to a vocation. He was part of the community he policed. He knew the people on those streets. He was connected, through the dense web of kinship that defines small southern cities, to Rachel's family. When the call came on February 12th, he was one of the first to respond. His son would later say his father rarely talked about what he saw at that scene, that he described it as traumatic in a way that stayed with a person permanently. That what had been done to Rachel was brutal, and that the fact that he knew her, that her family was his family's family, made it something he was never able to simply file away. So he didn't file it away. He opened a briefcase instead, and he spent the next 42 years filling it. That briefcase is the spine of this story. Not because it solved the case, though what was inside it mattered in the end, more than anyone outside the investigation may ever fully know, but because it represents something that the official record of this case does not. The refusal of one person to accept that known and forgotten are the same thing. Herbert knew who had done this. The community knew. And for 43 years, the gap between knowing and proving, between what a town held in its collective private memory and what an institution could put on the record, was wide enough for 4 men to live inside. This is the story of how that gap finally closed, and what it cost to close it. February 9th, 1982. Rachel was reported missing. She was 16 years old, a young mother, known in her neighborhood, known to the people on those streets. And then, on a Tuesday in early February, she wasn't where she was supposed to be. 3 days is a long time to be missing when you are 16. 3 days is long enough for the worst to have already happened. February 12th, 1982. The Dixie Trail Ride moved through Covington the way it did every year. Horses, covered wagons, families participating in a tradition that felt as permanent as the landscape itself. The trail wound through wooded sections of the city, past fairgrounds, past the kind of land that sits at the edge of town where nobody builds and nobody goes unless they have a reason. The riders had no reason to expect what they found. Her body was in a wooded area near the St. Tammany Parish Fairgrounds. She had been raped. She had been strangled. She had been left there. The medical examiner's findings were unambiguous on cause of death: strangulation. The specific details remain part of a case file that is now, finally, moving toward trial. What is documented in public record is this: Rachel was the victim of a rape and a homicide. The violence was deliberate. The location was deliberate. Someone had brought her to that wooded stretch near the fairgrounds, done what they did, and left her for the trail riders to find 3 days later. She was 16 years old. Her daughter was at home. The Covington Police Department responded. They processed the scene. They gathered what evidence they could from a wooded area in February 1982, a time before DNA analysis existed as a forensic tool, before digital records, before the investigative infrastructure that we now take for granted. The physical evidence available to them was limited by both the environment and the era. But limited physical evidence was not the only obstacle. The other obstacle was people, specifically the people who knew something and said nothing. Louisiana State Police investigators, speaking publicly decades later, would describe the original investigation as hampered by what they called a culture of fear in the area surrounding the people involved. That phrase, culture of fear, is careful institutional language. It means witnesses were afraid. It means people who knew things had decided, for reasons that made sense to them at the time, that speaking to police was more dangerous than staying quiet. In a town of 11,000 people where everyone knows everyone, where the men suspected of this crime were embedded in the same social fabric as the people who might have testified against them, that fear is not irrational. It is, in fact, entirely rational. Which makes the silence that followed not a mystery. It makes it a calculated outcome. The investigation ran. Leads were followed. Witnesses were interviewed. The machinery of a 1982 small-town homicide investigation moved through its paces. And at some point, the precise timeline is not fully documented in public record, it slowed. Then it stalled. Then it became what investigators call a legacy file. A case that gets inherited rather than solved. A folder that sits in a cabinet and gets reviewed when someone new comes in and decides to look, and then gets put back when the looking doesn't produce what's needed to move forward. There was one additional complication that muddied the early investigation in a way that would waste time and attention. A man named Henry Lucas, a serial killer whose confessions were, for a period in the 1980s, taken seriously by law enforcement agencies across the American South, claimed responsibility for Rachel's murder. He later recanted. Investigators debunked the claim. But the damage was done. A false confession, even a discredited one, creates noise in a case file. It gives investigators something to chase that leads nowhere. It obscures the actual trail at precisely the moment when the trail is still fresh enough to follow. By the time Lucas's confession was fully discredited, the original investigation had lost momentum it would not recover. The case went cold. Rachel's daughter grew up without a mother, and in Covington, Louisiana, the men who had done this continued to live. Some of them on the same streets where it happened, in the same town, under the same unremarkable sky. In 1982, a homicide investigation in a small Louisiana parish looked nothing like what we understand that process to be today. There was no CODIS, the national DNA database that now allows investigators to match biological evidence across cases and across decades. There was no forensic genealogy, no digital footprint to trace, no cell tower data, no surveillance cameras on every corner feeding footage into a searchable archive. There was no internet. There was no social media witness pool to mine for information that people might post publicly but never say to a detective's face. What there was: officers, notebooks, interviews, and whatever physical evidence the scene had preserved. In a wooded area, in February, 3 days after the crime occurred. The scene had not preserved much. The Covington Police Department worked the case with the tools they had. They canvassed. They interviewed. They followed the leads that presented themselves. The investigation in those early weeks had the urgency that fresh homicide cases carry, the awareness that time degrades evidence, that witnesses' memories shift, that the window for actionable information closes faster than anyone wants to admit. What they found was a community that would not fully open. Witnesses who had information, and based on everything investigators would say publicly decades later, There were people in Covington in 1982 who knew exactly what had happened to Rachel. Made a collective calculation. Speaking meant risk. Risk from the men involved. Risk from the social consequences of being the person who talked. In a community built on interconnection, being the one who cooperates with police is not a neutral act. It marks you. It changes your relationships. It can make you a target. So people talked to each other. And they stayed quiet with investigators. The case file grew to a point and then stopped growing. The physical evidence that had been collected was logged and stored, bagged, labeled, placed in the institutional custody of a system that would hold it for decades without the ability to do anything meaningful with it. In 1982, that evidence was a dead end. The technology to extract a DNA profile from it, to match that profile against a suspect, simply did not exist. The interviews produced fragments, suggestions, the kind of information that points investigators in a direction without giving them the documentation needed to act. Names circulated, suspicions accumulated. But suspicion is not a charge, and a community's collective knowledge, held privately, passed in whispers, never formalized, is not evidence. At some point in the mid-1980s, the false confession from Henry Lucas consumed investigative attention that might otherwise have been directed more productively. The claim was specific enough to be taken seriously and wrong enough to be a significant distraction. Investigators chased a thread that led nowhere. When it unraveled, they had to return to a starting point that was now several years older and considerably colder. There is a particular kind of institutional exhaustion that sets into cold cases. It is not indifference exactly. It is the accumulation of dead ends, the leads that don't pan out, the witnesses who recant or contradict themselves, the evidence that can't be processed, the confessions that fall apart, until the case reaches a kind of equilibrium where it is technically open but practically suspended. The file stays in the system. It gets reviewed periodically. A new detective inherits it and reads through what's there and makes a few calls and hits the same walls the last detective hit. This is what happened to Rachel's case through the late 1980s, through the 1990s, into the 2000s. The men who were eventually charged continued their lives. One of them had already been sentenced in 1984 to 21 years in prison for his role in a separate 1978 killing. He was connected to that crime through a cousin. The detail sits in a 1984 newspaper article like a footnote, a data point that would only become significant in retrospect. A man connected to one violent death in the late 1970s, now suspected of involvement in another in 1982. Moving through the same legal and social system that had processed him before. Nobody connected the dots publicly. Nobody could or would. Meanwhile, Officer Herbert kept his briefcase. He was no longer the young cop who had arrived first at the scene in February 1982. He had aged through a career, through years of working in the same community where this unsolved case sat like something everyone agreed not to look at directly. He had built a private archive, notes, clippings, the names he believed mattered, that represented what an institution had failed to sustain. One man's refusal to forget standing in for a system that had, functionally, moved on. His son would later describe watching his father maintain this parallel investigation across decades. The briefcase became a fixture, a presence in the household. Something that represented both his father's dedication and the weight of carrying something that had no resolution. Herbert knew the victim's family. He had stood at that scene. He had seen what was done to a 16-year-old girl who was somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, somebody's kin. He was not going to put the briefcase down. But one man's private archive is not a functioning investigation. And through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Rachel's case remained exactly what it had become. A legacy file, a name in a system, a folder on a shelf that represented a girl who had been failed twice, once when she was killed and once when the institutions built to answer for that killing quietly set her aside. The community knew. The silence held. There is a version of this story where the cold case is explained by circumstance, limited technology, a difficult scene, an era before DNA, a false confession that consumed investigative time, a community that wouldn't cooperate. That version is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because the circumstances don't fully explain 43 years. 43 years is not a forensic limitation. 43 years is a systemic one. The first failure happened in the weeks immediately after February 12, 1982. When a community will not cooperate with an investigation, the institution's job is to understand why and to find ways to work around the fear, or through it, or to protect the people who might be willing to speak if they believed speaking was safe. That work, if it was done, did not produce results. The culture of fear that Louisiana State Police investigators would describe publicly decades later, the understanding that the men involved were embedded in the community, that witnesses faced social and potentially physical consequences for talking, was not a secret in 1982. It was visible. It was the operating condition of the investigation from the beginning. What it required was a response proportional to the obstacle. What it received, based on everything that followed, was not that. The second failure was the Lucas distraction. Henry Lee Lucas was one of the most consequential false confessors in American criminal history. Between the early 1980s and the late 1990s, he claimed responsibility for hundreds of murders across the United States. Law enforcement agencies in multiple states accepted those confessions, closed cases, and moved on, only to discover, in many instances, that Lucas had been nowhere near the crimes he claimed. In 1984, a Texas Attorney General's investigation concluded that Lucas had fabricated the vast majority of his confessions. Rachel's case was one of those affected. The timeline matters here. If the false confession entered the Covington investigation in the mid-1980s, and the public record suggests it did, then investigators spent time, energy, and institutional attention pursuing a lead that was not a lead that had been manufactured by a man whose relationship to truth was, at best, instrumental. When that lead collapsed, the investigation did not simply return to where it had been. It returned to where it had been, minus the momentum, minus the urgency, minus the witnesses who might have spoken earlier and now had additional years of silence behind them. Silence that had hardened into habit. False confessions don't just waste time, they fossilize cases. The third failure is structural, and it is the one that implicates not just Covington or Louisiana, but the American system of cold case management as it existed through most of the late 20th century. Cold cases in most jurisdictions are not resourced as active investigations. They are maintained as open files, technically unsolved, theoretically pursuable, but they compete for investigative time and budget with cases that are current, cases with living victims and fresh evidence and political pressure to resolve. A 40-year-old homicide of a 16-year-old girl from a working-class family in a small Louisiana city is not, within that framework, a priority. That is not a criticism of any individual detective. It is a description of a system that decides, through resource allocation, which victims get sustained attention and which ones get a folder on a shelf. Rachel got a folder on a shelf. There is a detail in this case that makes the structural failure visible in a way that abstractions don't. The physical evidence collected at the scene in 1982, biological material that, with the right technology, could yield a DNA profile and match it to a suspect, sat in storage for decades. It wasn't lost, it wasn't destroyed, it was there. The technology to process it meaningfully arrived in stages through the 1990s and 2000s, becoming progressively more powerful and more accessible to law enforcement agencies across the country. CODIS expanded. Forensic genealogy emerged. The tools that could crack a 1982 case open were, by the mid-2000s, theoretically available. The evidence was not submitted for updated analysis until 2023, 41 years after the crime. That gap between when the technology became available and when it was applied to Rachel's case is not explained by science. It is explained by priority. The fourth failure belongs to the community, and it is the most complicated one to name. Because the people of Covington who had known since 1982, or who had heard enough over the years to understand what had happened, were not simply passive bystanders. They were participants in a silence that allowed 4 men to live free, in some cases in the same town, for decades. That silence had reasons. Fear is real. Social consequences are real. The calculation that speaking up could make your life worse, could make you a target, could cost you relationships and safety in a community where you had to keep living, that calculation is not irrational. But it is also not neutral. Every year that passed without someone coming forward was another year Rachel's daughter lived without answers. Another year the men who killed her mother moved through Covington unrestricted. Another year the case aged out of urgency and into the kind of permanent cold that institutions use to justify not looking. One local resident, speaking publicly after the 2025 arrests, described the silence this way. Nobody would talk about it, especially not outside. It was all hush-hush, don't talk about it outside the house. That description is not of ignorance. It is of a community that had absorbed a murder into its private knowledge and decided collectively to keep it there for 43 years. The fifth failure is the one nobody talks about because it requires asking a question that institutions are not designed to ask about themselves. If the names of the men eventually charged were circulating in Covington from early on, and everything in the public record suggests they were, then at what point did the investigation have enough to pursue them more aggressively? At what point did the culture of fear become something the system was accommodating rather than confronting? At what point did the open file become a closed assumption, the unspoken institutional conclusion that this case, with this victim in this community, was simply not going to move? Those questions don't have clean answers, but they are the right questions. And the fact that it took a local radio host producing a podcast in 2025 to generate the witnesses and leads that broke the case open, 43 years after a 16-year-old girl was found strangled in the woods, suggests that the answer to at least some of them is uncomfortable. The system did not solve this case. A podcast did. That is not a success story. That is an indictment wearing the costume of one. By 2023, most of the people who had been young in Covington in 1982 were in their 50s and 60s. The girl found in the woods near the fairgrounds had been dead for 41 years. Her daughter, the infant she had left behind, was now a grown woman. The officers who had worked the original case had retired or died or moved on to other things. The men suspected of the crime had lived entire lives in the shadow of something that was never formally named, and the case file sat where it had always sat, until the Louisiana State Police Covington Field Office made a decision. In 2023, detectives with the LSP assumed lead investigative responsibility for Rachel's case. This was not a dramatic moment. There was no press conference, no announcement, no public signal that something had shifted. It was an institutional decision, a cold case review, the kind that happens periodically in departments that maintain legacy files, usually triggered by a combination of available resources, new technology, and someone in a position of authority who decides that a particular case deserves another look. What made this review different was what they found when they looked. The original physical evidence, collected in February 1982, stored for 4 decades, never fully processed with modern forensic tools, was still there. They resubmitted it for DNA analysis. And the technology that hadn't existed when Rachel was killed, that had existed but been unavailable when investigators might have applied it in the 1990s and 2000s, now did what it was designed to do. It produced results. The DNA analysis connected biological material from the 1982 crime scene to the men who would eventually be charged. That connection, forensic, documentable, reproducible in a courtroom, was the thing the original investigation had never had. Not a whisper. Not a name circulating in the community. Not a suspicion held privately by a retired police officer in a brown leather briefcase. Evidence. The kind that transforms a cold case from a legacy file into an active prosecution. But DNA alone, in a case this old, is not always sufficient to build the full architecture of a criminal charge. Investigators needed more. They needed witnesses. They needed people who had known something for 43 years to finally say it on the record. And that is where the case hit the same wall it had always hit. The community. In 2025, the Louisiana State Police made an unconventional decision. They partnered with a local radio host to produce a podcast. The podcast was a direct address to the community of Covington, a public invitation, framed not as a police appeal, which the community had historically not responded to, but as a story, a narrative, the kind of thing people listen to while driving, while working, while sitting in the quiet of a house where they have held a secret for 4 decades. The host would later say that when he made an early remark questioning whether anyone still cared about what had happened, whether the case still meant something to the people of Covington, the response was overwhelming. It turns out there were a lot of people in this community who were deeply invested in Rachel's story. They had waited a long time. They just needed a format they trusted more than a police interview. The podcast changed the case, not metaphorically, concretely. New witnesses came forward. People who had been young in 1982 and had carried pieces of what they knew for decades, pieces they had never formalized, never put on record, never handed to an investigator, called in, wrote in, made contact. The leads those witnesses generated were actionable in ways that the original investigation's leads had never been. Because now there was DNA evidence waiting to be corroborated. Now there was a framework of forensic documentation that witness testimony could support rather than replace. The combination, old evidence processed with new technology, new witnesses generated by public engagement, broke 43 years of institutional stasis in less than 2 years. And then there was Herbert's briefcase. In the months before his death in October 2024, Herbert sat down with the Louisiana State Police detective leading the case. He opened the briefcase. He shared everything. Then he died, 6 months before the arrests, but his briefcase was in the room when they were made. April 21st, 2025. A SWAT team and a team of detectives arrived at a house in Covington, Louisiana. One of the men charged was arrested at home. The same city, the same streets, 43 years later. The same day, in a coordinated operation across state lines, agents from the Ohio Attorney General's Bureau of Criminal Investigation arrested a second man at a residence in Dayton, Ohio. He had left Covington. He had not left far enough. April 22nd, 2025. Investigators made contact with 2 additional men, both already incarcerated in Louisiana state facilities on unrelated charges. They were informed of the new charges against them. 4 men, all in their 60s, all charged with aggravated rape and second-degree murder. All of them had been teenagers or young adults in February 1982. Rachel's niece, the one who had not let this go, who had kept the case present in her family's life across decades, spoke publicly after the arrests. We appreciate the hard work and love that has been shown to this case. We hope that with justice will come healing and closure for our family, her loved ones, and the community. 43 years. That is how long a family waits when a community decides to stay quiet. That is how long justice takes when the system decides a case can wait. Rachel's daughter was an infant in February 1982. She did not know her mother. She could not have known her. She was too young to form a memory of a face, a voice, a smell, the specific weight of being held. What she has instead is the shape of an absence, the outline of a person who should have been there and wasn't, defined by everything that absence touched. First days of school, adolescence, her own relationships. The moments where a daughter turns to a mother and Rachel was not there to be turned to. That is not a tragedy that resolves. It is one that compounds. It accumulates across years, finds new forms, arrives in unexpected moments with the same weight it always carried. Nobody sentenced Rachel's daughter to that life, but 4 men and a community's silence made it inevitable. There is a particular cruelty in what the silence did to the people closest to this case. It was not the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of knowledge, of a community that had absorbed what happened into its private understanding and decided, for reasons that made sense within the social logic of Covington in 1982, to keep it there. For the people who loved Rachel, that silence was not neutral. It was a second injury. Every year that passed without an answer was a year the family was asked, implicitly, to accept that their daughter, their sister, their kin, was not worth the risk it would take to speak. Every year the men responsible moved through Covington, unrestricted, was a year the community demonstrated, through its inaction, where Rachel's life ranked in the hierarchy of things worth protecting. That message lands, whether it is spoken or not. Rachel's niece had not let this go. Through the years, through the silence, through the repeated absence of resolution, she had kept the case present in her family's life. When the podcast launched, she became one of its most visible advocates. When the arrests were announced, she spoke publicly. She would later say that when the podcast launched, she realized for the first time that it meant something to a lot of people beyond her family. That realization is complicated because it means the care was there, the investment was there. The community that had stayed silent in 1982 had not forgotten. It had carried the knowledge privately, the way communities carry things they don't know how to speak about publicly, with a kind of collective, unacknowledged grief. One local resident described the murder as a big black cloud on the community, something that sat over everything. That dimmed things. A cloud is not nothing. A cloud is a presence. But a presence is not justice. And grief held privately, grief that never becomes testimony, never becomes a name on a charge sheet, never becomes 4 men in handcuffs. That grief serves no one except the people who benefit from the silence. And then there is Herbert, a man who spent 42 years carrying a briefcase. His son watched him maintain that parallel archive across an entire lifetime, the notes accumulating, the clippings aging, the names staying current in a mind that refused to file them away. Herbert was not a saint. He was a police officer who had arrived at a scene and seen something that changed him, and who had spent the rest of his life trying to do something about it within the constraints of a system that had, functionally, moved on. The briefcase was not just documentation. It was an argument. An ongoing, private argument that Herbert was making with every institution that had decided this case could wait, that it could wait another year, another decade, another review cycle, until the people who remembered were old or gone, and the silence had become permanent by attrition. He lost the argument for 42 years, and then, in the final months of his life, sitting across from the detective with the briefcase open between them, he didn't. He died in October 2024. The arrests came in April 2025. 6 months. If Herbert had died 6 months later, he would have seen it. That gap, 6 months between a man's death and the justice he spent his life pursuing, is the kind of detail that doesn't fit anywhere cleanly. It is not a lesson. It is not a comfort. It is simply what happened, and it sits in the story like a stone. The 4 men charged in April 2025 were in their 60s. Whatever their lives had been across those 43 years, and at least 2 of them had spent significant portions of that time incarcerated for other crimes, they had lived, they had aged, they had had the time that Rachel did not have, the time her daughter grew up without a mother to witness. One of them had been in Covington the whole time, walking the same streets, living in the same city where people had whispered his name for decades and never said it loud enough for it to matter. until they did. For Rachel's family, the arrests were not a clean ending. The niece's words were careful. Grateful, yes. Hopeful for healing and closure, yes. But closure is a word that functions differently for families than it does for institutions. For institutions, closure means a case moves from open to resolved, a change in filing status, a bureaucratic completion. For a family, closure means learning to live with the fact that the answer came 43 years too late to change what the absence had already cost. Rachel's daughter grew up. She grew up without a mother, in a town that knew why, in a community that held the answer to the question of her mother's death in its collective memory for 4 decades and did not speak. That is what this silence produced. Not an unsolved mystery, a solvable one, left unsolved by choice for 43 years. Let's be precise about what happened here. A 16-year-old girl was raped and murdered in February 1982. The men responsible were known to the community within which they lived. Physical evidence existed at the scene. Witnesses existed who had information. And the case remained officially unsolved for 43 years. Not because the truth was inaccessible, but because the institutions responsible for pursuing it did not pursue it with the sustained force the case required. That is not a cold case. That is a failure with a specific shape. The first thing to name is the evidence gap. The biological material collected at the scene in 1982 was not submitted for updated DNA analysis until 2023. Meaningful DNA forensics became available to American law enforcement in stages through the 1990s. The technology that eventually produced actionable results in this case existed, in some form, for roughly 30 years before it was applied. 30 years. That is not a technology problem. Technology does not apply itself. Evidence does not submit itself for analysis. Those decisions are made by people within institutions according to priorities that reflect judgments, explicit or implicit, about which cases deserve the investment. Rachel's case did not receive that investment for 3 decades after the tools to crack it became available. The question of why is not answered by anything in the public record. But the question needs to be asked. The second thing to name is the community responsibility question. And this one is harder because it implicates not a system, but people. The culture of fear that investigators described was real. The social and potentially physical risk that witnesses faced in 1982 was real. Fear is not an excuse that can be dismissed from a comfortable distance, but fear has a half-life. The men who might have physically threatened witnesses in 1982 were teenagers and young adults then. By the time a decade had passed, the immediate social dynamics of that threat had shifted. By the time 2 decades had passed, shifted further. By 2005, 2010, 2015, when multiple witnesses were still alive, still in possession of what they knew, the original conditions of fear had transformed significantly, and still the silence held. Which means at some point, the silence stopped being about fear and started being about something else. Habit. The path of least resistance. The human tendency to not disrupt an equilibrium that has held for long enough to feel permanent. That is a different thing than fear. And it cost Rachel's family another decade of waiting on top of the decades they had already absorbed. The third thing to name is the podcast question. And it is the most structurally damning element of this entire case. In 2025, a local radio host produced a podcast. That podcast generated new witnesses, new leads, information that had not previously reached investigators on the record. It broke in months a logjam that 43 years of conventional investigation had not broken. The obvious question is, why did it work when official appeals had not? The answer, based on everything investigators and the podcast host said publicly, is format and trust. People in Covington who knew things did not trust the formal apparatus of a police interview. They did not trust that speaking to investigators would be safe or confidential or consequential in the right direction. The institutional relationship between law enforcement and this community had not produced the conditions under which people felt safe to speak. A podcast created a different relationship. It was public, not private. It was a story, not an interrogation. It gave people permission to think about the case as something that still mattered, rather than something the official record had already determined was unresolvable. That shift, from institutional appeal to public narrative, is what moved the case. Which means the institution had, for decades, been using the wrong tool for the specific obstacle it faced. That is a systems failure, not a personal one, not a moral one. A design failure. A failure to adapt the investigative approach to the specific social conditions of the community in which the crime had occurred. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different. Dead Ends exists for cases like this one. Cases where the official record is incomplete. Cases where the silence has lasted long enough that people have stopped asking why. Cases where a 16-year-old girl and the 43 years her family waited deserve more than a filing status change. Subscribe to Dead Ends and stay with us for every case that was never truly closed. Because closing a case and resolving one are not the same thing. 4 men have been charged. The legal process is underway. The DNA evidence is in the hands of prosecutors. The witnesses who finally spoke are on the record. But the deeper questions this case raises, about how institutions decide which victims are worth sustained investment, about how communities maintain silence across generations, about what it costs a family to wait 43 years for an answer that was theoretically available much sooner, those questions are not answered by an arrest. They are opened by one. As of April 2025, 4 men stand charged with aggravated rape and second-degree murder in connection with the killing of Rachel in Covington, Louisiana, in February 1982. They are not convicted. That distinction matters, and this channel will not collapse it. Charges are the beginning of a legal process. They represent the state's assertion that sufficient evidence exists to bring a case to trial. They are not a verdict. They are not guilt established under the standard that the American legal system requires, beyond a reasonable doubt, tested in open court before a jury of peers. What exists, as of this recording, is a case in motion. For the first time in 43 years, one man was arrested on April 21, 2025, at his home in Covington, Louisiana. He was booked into St. Tammany Parish Jail. His son spoke publicly after the arrest, stating that his father maintained his innocence. A second man was arrested the same day in Dayton, Ohio, by agents from the Ohio Attorney General's Bureau of Criminal Investigation. He was booked into a county jail and was awaiting extradition to Louisiana at the time of the most recent public reporting. 2 additional men were already incarcerated within the Louisiana Department of Corrections on unrelated charges when investigators made contact with them on April 22, 2025. Both were informed of the new charges. All 4 face charges of aggravated rape and second-degree murder under Louisiana law. The district attorney for the 22nd Judicial District indicated publicly that his office would present the case before a grand jury. That process, the formal legal step that determines whether the charges proceed to trial, was pending at the time of the most recent available reporting. The DNA evidence that formed the forensic backbone of the investigation is expected to be central to the prosecution's case. The witness testimony generated by the podcast, the people who came forward after decades of silence, represents the corroborating layer that investigators needed to build around the forensic findings. Whether that combination is sufficient to secure convictions in a case where the crime occurred 43 years ago, where memories have aged and some witnesses have died, and the evidentiary chain spans decades of storage and multiple custodial transfers, is a question that will be answered in a courtroom. Not here. What can be said here, based on the public record, is this. The physical evidence was preserved. The DNA analysis produced results that investigators found actionable enough to make arrests. The Louisiana State Police, the Covington Police Department, and the District Attorney's Office have all committed publicly to the prosecution of this case. That is more than existed at any point in the previous 4 decades. For Rachel's family, the current state of the case is neither resolution nor closure. It is the beginning of a process that will require them to re-enter, publicly and formally, the details of what happened to Rachel in February 1982. It will require them to sit in a courtroom and watch the men charged with her rape and murder exercise their legal rights, to counsel, to confrontation of evidence, to a jury's judgment. That process is correct. It is how the system is supposed to work. It is also, for a family that has waited 43 years, another form of waiting. Rachel's niece said after the arrests that she hoped justice would bring healing and closure for the family, for Rachel's loved ones, and for the community. The word hope is doing significant work in that sentence. Officer Herbert's contribution to the case is now part of the official investigative record. The briefcase he carried for 42 years, the notes, the names, the private archive of a man who refused to accept the silence, was shared with the lead investigator in the final months of Herbert's life. That material informed the investigation that produced the arrests. Herbert died in October 2024. A man's life's work, 42 years of refusal to forget. Now evidence. As of this recording, no trial date has been set. The case is active, the men are charged, the family is waiting. And Rachel's daughter, the infant left behind in February 1982, now a grown woman in her 40s, is watching a legal process move through its stages toward something that might finally be called an answer. 43 years. That is how long it took to get here. There is a brown leather briefcase somewhere in Louisiana right now. Its owner is dead, but what was inside it is alive in a courtroom, in charge sheets, in DNA reports, in the testimony of witnesses who finally found their voices after 4 decades of silence. Herbert spent 42 years making an argument that nobody in an official capacity was willing to fully hear. The argument was simple. She mattered. Covington is still a city of roughly 11,000 people. The fairgrounds are still there. The trails that riders followed in February 1982 still wind through the same wooded stretches. The lake is still visible from the north shore on a clear day. The men charged with Rachel's murder grew old in that landscape. Some of them never left. They watched the same seasons come and go, walked the same streets, existed in the same community that had decided in the aggregate that knowing was not the same as speaking. For 43 years that calculus held. Until it didn't. What breaks a silence like this one is never a single thing. It is accumulation. A detective in 2023 who decides a legacy file deserves another look. A radio host who asks whether anyone still cares and discovers the answer is yes. A technology that can read biological evidence that was invisible to the tools of 1982. A retired cop's briefcase, passed to the right hand 6 months before its keeper died. A niece who refused to let her aunt become a footnote. None of those things alone breaks 43 years. All of them together did. The questions this case leaves open are not comfortable ones. How many cases like this one exist in the filing systems of small American cities? How many cold files contain evidence that has never been resubmitted? Witnesses who have never been reapproached through a format they might actually respond to? Communities whose silence has been accepted as permanent when it was never permanent? Only patient? How many brown leather briefcases are out there, held by people who never found the right hands to pass them to? Those questions don't have a number attached to them. They have a direction. Rachel was 16 years old. She was a mother. She was known in her community, known to the men who killed her, known to the people who stayed quiet about it, known to a police officer who spent his career refusing to accept that known and forgotten were the same thing. She deserved better from every institution that touched her case. She deserved better from the community that held its knowledge in private for 43 years. Her daughter deserved better. The silence was not inevitable. It was chosen. And the fact that it was finally broken does not retroactively justify the 43 years it held. If this case stayed with you, it should. Not because it is exceptional, because it isn't. Subscribe to Dead Ends. Share this episode with someone who thinks the system always works or always fails, or that the truth always comes out in time. Tell them about a brown leather briefcase. Tell them about a 16-year-old girl and 43 years and a podcast that did what 4 decades of official investigation had not. Tell them Rachel's name. And if you have a case you believe deserves this kind of attention, a name that hasn't been said loudly enough, a file that hasn't been opened in too long, leave it in the comments. Every case on this channel started as a name someone refused to stop saying. Next time on Dead Ends, we go back to a case where the only witness was a child, where the testimony that convicted a man came from someone too young to understand what they were being asked to say, and where the conviction stood for 20 years before anyone looked closely enough at what the child had actually seen. Stay with us.